Hello, my name is Nicole Mela. I'm the Deputy Online Editor at MaltaToday. And for this week's interview, I'm here with Professor Mark Rozell, an expert on US government and politics and the founding dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. We're going to talk about the upcoming presidential election that will take place this November on the opposite side of the Atlantic. Professor, thank you for joining us today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
On the abortion issue in this election, this has become quite a heated topic in the political discourse, especially since the overturn of Roe versus Wade. Abortion rights have largely been a winning issue for the Democrats, but for the Republicans, let's say the party has struggled a bit to find that sort of coherent message. How will this issue, 2 years after the overturn of Roe versus Wade, affect this election?
So if you look at the polling data in this presidential campaign, it's clear that of all the public policy issues that voters prioritize, the one issue where Kamala Harris has the greatest advantage is abortion. So the abortion decision in 2022 by the United States Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade and 49 years of protection of abortion rights was extremely unpopular in the United States, so much so that even in cases of Republican-leaning states where they had referenda to restrict abortion access, the voters voted no. So this is a good issue for the Democrats, but importantly, voters prioritize different issues in election campaigns. And there are many voters who may not like Donald Trump's position on abortion, but they're more concerned about the state of the economy, rising inflation. And if they think that Donald Trump has the answer to those issue areas, they may vote for him anyway, even though they disagree with his position on abortion. So it really does come down to how voters prioritize the issues in making their voting decision.
And what are some of the key issues that you see are influencing the campaign so far?
So the state of the economy and rising inflation are at the very top of the list of voters' concerns. So there have been polls taken asking voters what are the issues they most prioritize in this election. The state of the economy overall is number one. But in addition to rising inflation, the state of the economy, jobs, unemployment, also immigration has risen very high in the list of voter concerns. And then there's a host of other issues that are typical of any American election cycle. Healthcare, education, climate issues. The abortion issue falls down about fifth or sixth in priority in a number of polls. It's not at the very top. So again, it really comes down to what issues voters think are the most important in making their voting decision and which candidate they think has the right answers on those issues.
And if you were to compare the two campaigns of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, maybe just a quick overview of how you see that these campaigns are trying to target these issues.
So the Trump campaign has been talking a lot about the rising inflation. They like to show the data showing where grocery prices were when he was president, where petrol prices were compared to where they are today. Of course, what they're trying to do is tar Kamala Harris as a part of the Biden administration during which the United States has had very high rising inflation rates, rising gasoline or petrol prices, rising prices at the grocery store in particular. The things that in people's lived experiences they're seeing every single day and many Americans are frustrated about. And whether fair or not, the reality is many Americans blame the political party that holds the White House during economically anxious times. So to the extent that Trump can focus his message on those issues, I think that's going to play very well for him. Kamala Harris, by contrast, has to showcase that she is her own person. She's not Joe Biden. She has her own plans for the next 4 years, and that she has a better plan to fix the American economy and deal with rising inflation and other issues that people are concerned about. And I think much of the election for the relatively few voters who are undecided at this point will really be decided by the messaging by these two candidates on those issues of top concern to voters.
Maybe now just to move on foreign policy, some do fear a sort of situation where, let's say Donald Trump is elected president this year, could he disengage from NATO, for example, engage more with Russia, and all this in a very tense time geopolitically. Are these fears justified, or is it more of a pre-election hype, so to speak?
So it's a difficult question to answer because Mr. Trump is not an easily predictable political figure. I've lectured on several European countries this year about the US elections, and I have heard repeatedly and understandably a deep concern about what Trump's priorities will be regarding America's traditional alliances should he be elected again, particularly about America's commitment to NATO. And these, again, are, I think, very well-founded concerns because of some of the things that Mr. Trump himself has said and threatened. Remember that horrible comment he made some time ago about, I'm paraphrasing, Mr. Putin can do whatever the hell he wants if the member states don't pay up their fair share, as he calls it, for NATO. So there's two different ways to look at it. He means it. He's a threat to the traditional alliances. And he is actually very enamored of strongman leaders and authoritarian leaders in other countries. Or this is Trump the negotiator taking the extreme outlier position as a threat to make others think maybe he actually will do it and pull America out of its traditional alliances and won't fulfill America's commitments to NATO. And therefore, we have to do something to get in line with what he's demanding in order to sustain American support. And I just have to be honest, I don't know which one it is. He's not an easily predictable character, but I do absolutely understand the concerns that many of America's allies have abroad based on his past rhetoric and also some of his past actions when he was president as well, and some of the fawning comments he's made about Vladimir Putin, which I imagine is quite shocking to many people on this continent.
Yeah, and maybe to remain a bit on the foreign policy issue, but take it a bit more maybe into the local American context. The Israel-Gaza conflict, I mean, it's quite a discussion. There's a lot happening in the Middle East right now as well. But in America, the Jewish vote is quite influential. And in the past, it has tended more towards the political left, but there does seem to be indications of a potential move to the political right. Could that be the case?
Yeah, so the polling data show that the overwhelming majority of Jewish Americans still lean Democratic, not Republican voting. But there has been a rising minority of Republican voting Jews in the United States. Mr. Trump appealed to ultra-Orthodox Jews, for example, those who say that they want to take a very staunch in defense of Israel's self-interest position. And so there has been a decline in the Republican losses among Jewish voters in the United States, but we have not seen a fundamental shift of Jewish voting from Democrat to majority Republican.
Okay, and
we're talking about maybe 2% of the American population too, so that should be kept in mind.
Yes,
Yeah.
and how does the conflict possibly impact the American Muslim voting population?
So where it really matters, I think, is in the state of Michigan. So projections say that there are upwards of 300,000 Arab Americans in the state of Michigan. So as you know, this presidential election is going to be fought in 6 or 7 key, we call swing states in the Electoral College, where it's not clear which candidate has the advantage right now, but those states will decide the election, Michigan being one of them. The margins in Michigan in the latest 2 election cycles were very close, projected to be very close again. And the polling data show that Mr. Biden's support, for example, among Arab Americans has declined dramatically since the Israel-Gaza war. And that's particularly concerning for Kamala Harris because, of course, as a part of the Biden-Harris administration, those who are unhappy with the current administration's policies in support of Israel and its actions in Gaza are naturally going to hold her somewhat to account for that. But on the other hand, she needs to have a somewhat different message from Joe Biden in this campaign about how the U.S. acts going forward regarding the Israel-Gaza crisis. And she needs to separate herself somewhat from the policies that have alienated many Muslim and Arab Americans from their usual strong support, actually, for Democratic presidential candidates.
You mentioned that the election is going to be mostly fought within like this very small number of states.
Yes.
Could you maybe just elaborate a bit more on possibly the demographic makeup in these states to get an idea of which voting groups might hold a bit more influence in those areas, as well as maybe the issues that are a bit more specific to these states, if there are.
Right. Yeah, so I just mentioned Michigan, right, where with upwards of 300,000 Arab Americans who are very discontented with the current administration's policies, that's a problem for Kamala Harris because in the 2020 election cycle, close to 70% of Arab Americans in Michigan voted for Joe Biden. And yet very few right now are saying that they will support the Democratic Party ticket. And if you have very close margins in Michigan, that can make a huge difference. Or look, for example, at the issue of rising inflation in the United States, which has started to come down, by the way, but many Americans compare where we are now as opposed to where we were, say, 4 years ago when Trump was president. If you look at the vast rising during the Biden administration petrol prices nationally, well, the curve is even worse if you go to Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, 4 of the 7 swing states in the Electoral College. If you look at rising inflation rates, it's a little bit worse in some of the swing states than the overall national average. So these state-by-state factors do matter because in the Electoral College, with 43 states, as we say, mostly out of play, we already know they're going to go either Democrat or Republican, and the election falling in the hands of only 7 states. State-level local issues that would normally play out in, say, a U.S. Senate campaign or a gubernatorial campaign are actually key in a national presidential election campaign. But, in terms of the demographics, I would have to go state by state in detail, which would take a little too long. But, for example, Georgia now is one of 7 states in America that has a majority minority population. The minority population growth has been quite substantial there. And so even 10 years ago, it was unthinkable to most political analysts that Georgia would go Democratic, as it did in 2020 for Joe Biden plus 2 United States senators. But much of that had to do with the shifting demographics due to in-migration and immigration that have swelled the ranks of minority voters in the state. And the Democratic Party happens to be a coalition of minorities, and the Republican Party is overwhelmingly a white party. So that's just one example in one state where the shifting demographics have actually changed the fundamentals of state politics with regard to partisanship.
And just to move on to a different topic, about political violence, so to speak, have the risks of political violence increased since the last presidential election? And when it comes to that violence, it doesn't necessarily mean the violence of, say, the January 6th Capitol riots, but possibly also harassment or threats, and this a very wide definition of violence. Has this been on the rise since the last election?
It's been on the rise, and it's deeply concerning. So you have nonpartisan poll workers, for example, people who go to the voting precincts and volunteer their time as election officials, right, to make sure that the elections take place smoothly. Some of these people have been subjected to harassment and threats, for example. Election officials in 2020 in states that determined the outcome of the race, many of them were subjected to all kinds of hate mail and phone calls and other forms of personal harassment. It's deeply concerning because you have a lot of good people who otherwise would volunteer their time who say maybe it's not worth it to go through all of this. That's ultimately bad for our democratic republic to have people saying, because of the intensified anger that's out there in the electorate, and conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated beliefs that elections are being thwarted and stolen and tampered with and so on, maybe we just don't want to volunteer our time or, work on behalf of the elections process because of the potential for harassment and even violence. And of course, I'm answering this question after there have been 2 assassination attempts on one of the 2 major party nominees, Mr. Trump, right? So to have seen the violence of January 6th, 2 assassination attempts, and then threats against election workers, for example, and even some other partisan officials, we're in a very different place in the United States than even just 10, 15 years ago, which is very regrettable, deeply concerning, and I'm not sure what the path is out of that right now.
Yeah, in fact, how do you see this violence possibly evolving as we get closer to the election and possibly after the election as well?
Yeah, so there is a lot of concern about what will happen in this election if, for example, yet again, it turns out to be extremely close and only several thousand or tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states separate the 2 candidates from each other and determine the outcome. Particularly if Mr. Trump is on the losing side of that equation, he is the one who is likely to charge that there's been election fraud, that the election is not legitimate. There's a shockingly large percentage of Americans who identify as Republicans who don't consider Joe Biden the legitimately elected president of the United States. That's never happened in my lifetime. In following, observing American politics for several decades. Again, we're in a very, very different place right now where people are just questioning the integrity of the process and the legitimacy of election outcomes. And Mr. Trump's been very successful in activating his supporters to believe in his messaging that there is corruption in American elections, which, by the way, it's been studied and studied by nonpartisan groups. It's been litigated repeatedly. There is no evidence of widespread or even any election fraud in the United States. The integrity of our process is absolutely secure, and every independent analysis has confirmed that. But there is a significant minority of the American population that believes instead these conspiracy theories about our elections. And that's what's spawning a lot of this intensified anger and causing the potential for spilling out into violence. If people believe in their heart of hearts, they stole our election. Our guy didn't get elected because they stuffed ballots or voting machines were corrupted or what have you. You start to understand why people might start marching in protest and doing even worse. Not to justify it, but if they believe that kind of messaging, you understand how we actually got to this point, that people could start reacting against the system that they think somehow has been fundamentally corrupted.
And do you think that this causes maybe political alienation, or or maybe does it have the opposite effect where it charges people up a bit more politically?
Yeah, well, it's really charged people up and not in a good way necessarily. So we have higher voting turnout rates, right? In America, there's no mandatory voting. So people can choose not to vote or to vote. That's their choice. We've seen rising turnout rates, but we're seeing rising turnout rates during periods of intensified agitation over the electoral process and belief in almost like it's an Armageddon if the other side wins the election, that America simply can't go on and continue as it is if my side doesn't win, right? So intensified polarization has had, I think, a very deep-seated effect on people's participation level, but not all of that participation is uplifting or positive. Some of it is very negatively directed as a form of intensified opposition against those on the other side. And this is quite a change in American politics and culture. So I'm a political scientist who studied American politics for about 4 decades as an academic professor. And we always in the past talked about the existence of two very middle-of-the-road mainstream political parties with nuanced differences on ideology and issue positions. But Americans always felt generally safe whether one side or the other won because the differences were not so stark from each other. And some people complain maybe the parties should be a little bit more distant from each other, and maybe we need something, more like the British parliamentary system, or, a system where you have a much more clear choice between different partisan ideologies. Well, we've moved in a very different direction away from the conventional norm of mainstream moderate political parties with differences, but not fundamental differences, to a perception that these two parties stand for completely different things. And the Democratic Party has moved to the progressive left, and that's where its center is now. And the Republican Party has moved to the very far right, and that's where it's centered. And the middle of the electorate is feeling perhaps the most discontented or disenfranchised by the choice, the binary choice that they're left with between two political parties that have moved out to the ideological extremes in the views of many observers.
And maybe on a lighter topic,
Yes.
the topic of celebrity endorsements. Because it has been a bit of a topic over the summer. Taylor Swift, I believe, has come out endorsing Kamala Harris, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Other celebrities are either have endorsed a candidate or are resisting endorsing a candidate, but also getting a bit of pressure and flack maybe for choosing to do that. At the end of the day, do these endorsements have an impact on the vote, so to speak, on the election? Yeah.
So I'm going to advise Americans who get excited about this or that celebrity endorsing your favorite candidate, don't get so excited about it. There is no evidence that these endorsements have any significant impact on actual voting behavior. Now, will it be different this year? Potentially. So I talked to a lot of young people, many of whom love Taylor Swift, and they got all excited when she made an endorsement because they like Kamala Harris and they think that's going to make the difference. And I tell them, I remember 2004 when Bruce Springsteen endorsed John Kerry against George W. Bush. And everybody loves Bruce Springsteen in America. Even Republicans like Bruce Springsteen. And Bruce Springsteen was campaigning all over the country with John Kerry, campaigning for him. John Kerry never became a president. I can tell you time and again when influential celebrities have made these endorsements, it got a little bit of emphasis in a news cycle or two. Some people got excited about it, but then the polling data showed it just didn't really make any difference to voting behavior.
And the final question,
yes.
Do you feel comfortable giving a prediction for the election?
Well, I don't feel comfortable giving a prediction that one or the other candidate will win because I think it's entirely too close right now. But I'll say this. Of the swing states in the Electoral College, I think Kamala Harris right now, if she has an advantage, it's in the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin. I think probably Trump has a little bit of an advantage in the South, North Carolina and Georgia, and possibly in the Southwest, Arizona and Nevada. So potentially the whole election comes down to Pennsylvania, number 7, right? If Kamala Harris wins the 2 upper Midwest states, Michigan and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, she's got it. She's president. She's got enough Electoral College votes with all the solid blue states to be president. So I think Pennsylvania is absolutely critical. Now, one thing I think that's important to point out, Kamala Harris has somewhat grown her national public opinion polling support over time since becoming a candidate. Right now, the average of the national polls has her up about 3% nationally over Donald Trump. But we don't elect presidents by national popular vote. It's winner take all, state by state in the Electoral College, and it's those 7 key states that matter. The margins are much more thin in those 7 key states in the Electoral College than they are in the national popular opinion polls. That's a potential problem for Kamala Harris because Donald Trump in the past has slightly outperformed what the polls suggested he would achieve on election day. And so the fact that in those 7 key states in the Electoral College, these 2 candidates are within the statistical margin of error of each other, I think that gives Mr. Trump perhaps just a little bit of advantage right now. What we don't know over the next several weeks is whether Kamala Harris is going to continue her positive momentum, which is, I think, absolutely necessary, because where things stand right now, I'd probably want to be in Mr. Trump's position and not hers, thinking about who has the better chance of being elected. But that's not a prediction. What looks like right now can fundamentally change anytime between now and November 5th.
Yes, no, thank you very much for that insight.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for following this interview with us. I'm Nicole Mela, Deputy on 9 Editor at Malta Today. Thank you for watching this interview. You can find this interview on our website as well as on all social media.